It's 5 minutes after 12. Looks like we have a nice virtual room full of participants. Welcome, everyone. Mike, would you like to kick us off?
Yes, everyone, welcome to our webinar on how banks can reduce their financed emissions. I'm Michael Lear, board member at the Impact Capital Forum, and in my day job, I'm a private wealth advisor for Capital Group here in New York. I'm sitting here in my home in New Jersey, but where I've been for about the past year, but hopefully at some point I'll get back to the city. Thank you all for joining us. Before I get started, I'd like to give you some background on the Impact Capital Forum. We were founded in 2003, and we were previously named the Microfinance Club of New York. Since that time, we've expanded our scope to address all aspects of financial capital, human capital, technology, and natural resources that benefit the world through the lens of financial services. ICF now has over 3,500 individuals in our network. Most members are professionals with a background in financial services, financial inclusion, and fintech. However, our membership is open to anyone that supports the club's mission. We host approximately 25 events per year on a wide range of topics relevant to impact investing and social enterprise. On April 14th, we'll be hosting a networking lunch, and later that day in the evening, we'll have a webinar on learning to integrate ESG, and I hope you can all join us for those events as well. If you enjoyed today's discussion, and I'm sure you will, I encourage you to consider membership. It's relatively inexpensive and a great way to show support for your community. And with that, I will toss it back to Emma Jenkins, who will be moderating our panel. Emma, take it away.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you to the entire Impact Capital Forum for making this event possible. I'm thrilled to be able to gather a group of such talented and purpose-driven individuals to discuss about how banks can reduce their financed emissions. I am an MBA student at Bard College's MBA in Sustainability, and my capstone/thesis project is dedicated to researching exactly this topic. So I'm thrilled to be able to share some of those insights with everyone in attendance. And I will do some brief introductions of our panelists and participants. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. It would be great to know who is among us. But I'll start by introducing Gabe. Gabe Malek has contributed thought leadership on sustainable finance with the UNEP, SASB, and the IEN. He's currently the Investor Influence Coordinator at the Environmental Defense Fund, where he works with the financial services industry on net zero commitments with a focus on decarbonizing oil and gas and transportation sectors. Welcome, Gabe. Thanks so much for coming. Next, I'll introduce Carrie Krasinski. Carrie is the co-founder of Carbon Tracker, the Real Impact Tracker, and the Sustainable Finance Institute. He teaches courses on sustainable innovation and finance at Yale, Brown, and NYU. And he's published many books. His most recent and 7th book is Modern China, which calls for more cooperation for problem-solving sustainability challenges. So thank you, Cary, for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you. We also have Ivan Frishberg, who leads Amalgamated's work around their climate commitments, measuring ESG impact and engagement initiatives as the Director of Impact Policy for Amalgamated Bank and its Charitable Foundation. Ivan is also chair of Pcaf North America, which we'll learn about shortly if you're not familiar. He's also co-chair of the UNEP FI Working Group on target setting for the collective commitment for climate action. So thank you for being here, Ivan. Welcome. And lastly, I'll introduce Nicole Labotong. She supports some of the world's largest financial institutions in measuring and disclosing their financed greenhouse gas emissions as an associate director at Guidehouse, a leading provider of sustainability strategy consulting services for Fortune 500 companies. And Nicole is the North American lead for Pcaf, which is an industry-led initiative that has over 100 global members holding over 27 trillion US dollars in assets, all dedicated to reducing their financed emissions. So Nicole, really excited that you could be with us today so that you can share technical background and kind of give us a financed emissions 101. So I'll hand it over to you, and you can share your slides.
Thanks so much, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today about Pcaf. See if I can share my slides. Are they up now?
Not yet.
Hmm.
Um,
No?
Something's happening now. Yes, we can see that.
Okay, great. So I'll give you an overview of what Pcaf is and why it's needed, and then you'll hear from Ivan in a bit on how it's practically applied at Amalgamated Bank. So understanding how much greenhouse gas emissions your organization is generating helps you understand your contribution to climate change, which is important for a number of reasons. Until Pcaf, financial institutions all had their own way of conducting these calculations, since there was no universal standard to follow. So back in 2011, to give you a bit of history on our journey to where we are now in the standard, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the most common standard corporations use to measure their footprint, tried to develop a methodology to measure financed emissions, but the conditions weren't quite right. Essentially, the market wasn't ready for the standard to be created. But the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has guidance on emissions generated from other activities. However, a detailed methodology on the emissions from loans and investments, that is, financed emissions, didn't take hold at that time. So in 2015, a group of Dutch banks in the lead up to COP21 decided that we needed the standard and started to develop a methodology for financed emissions. So it was launched there. Membership since then has continued to grow. In 2018, we got a slew of members in North America. Since then, we've expanded globally. We now have over 100 members with over $28 trillion in assets in all regions that have worked together to come up with the Pcaf standard. So that was launched late last year. Our aim is to become the standard for the financial industry to quantify the emissions associated with financial institutions, loans and investments. And so we're collaborating with a number of different organizations. Importantly, among other institutions, we're working with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. You can see the sticker on the left bottom part of the slide here that says that we're in alignment with their standard, which is the most widely used in the industry for corporate greenhouse gas accounting. So Pcaf is, as Emma was saying, a member-led organization, and it's also the methodology. I'm part of the secretariat, so Guidehouse is here to help with technical and operational support. But since the financial institutions that are part of Pcaf help to build it, it helps to ensure that it's going to be used and that we have a critical mass of financial institutions implementing the standard going forward. A little more detail on what financed emissions are. I'll give you a brief overview of scopes and try to break down what's a somewhat busy slide here, but your greenhouse gas emissions are basically bucketed into how much control you have over them, and those are your emission scopes. Traditionally, organizations would focus on what they can most directly influence. So scope 1 is what you own and control. And then scope 2 is your indirect emissions. Particularly, it's your purchased electricity, heat, and steam. You're not generating those emissions, but you're driving them through your electricity consumption and heat generation. And then scope 3 is everything else in your value chain, both upstream, what your suppliers are emitting, and downstream, what your customers, borrowers, and investees are emitting. So while previously, a lot of what financial institutions reported on was their office buildings or their electricity, because that's easy to measure, it's not representative of where most of their impact lies. Nearly all of their emissions are driven from loans and investments. And so Pcaf plays a role of providing this harmonized standard for financial institutions to measure and disclose what those emissions are. The general principle behind Pcaf is that you're looking at all of the emissions from everyone you're lending to or investing in, but the part that you're attributing to your financial institution is just equivalent to the outstanding amount of those loans and investments over total equity plus debt. So this is the general principle behind the methodology. It gets into a lot more detail for various asset classes that it covers. And there's some differences there in terms of the terms used. But this is what it's essentially founded upon. So you calculate it by multiplying an attribution factor specific to an asset class by the emissions of a borrower and investee. And the attribution factor is, I was mentioning, what you see on the left-hand side of the equation here. And yeah, as your investment changes over time, so does the amount of emissions that you're attributing to your organization. And this is applied on an annual basis. So we're currently covering 6 asset classes in the current version of the standard. It's listed equity and corporate bonds, business loans and unlisted equity, project finance, commercial real estate, mortgages, and motor vehicle loans. But we're coming out with a new version later this year. Since the methodology is created to meet the needs of its members, as we've grown, new members have asked that it expand to other areas. So the next version will include sovereign debt, negative emissions, capital market instruments, and green bonds. So busy slide here again, but I really just wanted to point out where measuring financed emissions fits in a financial institution's overall climate journey. It's an essential first step in a lot of other areas. So if you understand your emissions, it'll help you understand what your transition risks are, for example, with scenario analysis. It provides you with a baseline to measure your science-based or net zero emissions targets against. It helps you develop a strong climate strategy by knowing where your emissions are in your portfolio. And it helps also with taking action and demonstrating that you have this understanding. And it also meets disclosure requirements, which is an area that a lot of financial institutions are feeling more pressure around going forward. So I'll stop there for now. We'll hear a bit more from Ivan, but yeah, please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Nicole. We'll hand it over to Ivan.
Thanks, Nicole. Emma, do you want me to just plow ahead, or are you going to
Yes,
stop?
yes, go right ahead.
Questions? Say again.
Go right ahead. Thanks.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. My name is Ivan Frishberg. As Emma was saying, Director of Impact Policy at Amalgamated Bank. I asked Nicole to include this slide just for a little bit of starting context about Amalgamated. We are a nearly 100-year-old bank. We were started by a labor union in New York City and are now really, I think, America's leading socially responsible bank. We have about $6 billion in assets. As you can see, what we do in the world is really driven by impact and by values. And it's sort of best reflected through our portfolio. So these are the impact sectors that we count. And for many years, but particularly recently, we've had this focus on not sort of moving from just a kind of values screen, but to really thinking about how do we achieve triple bottom line? How do we measure and understand the impact of the lending work that we do? And any bank that will sort of tell you, like, here's the great things we do and here's the impact and the positive things, but they're kind of less quick to kind of be transparent about the full scope of impact of the portfolio that they have. When we started looking at this and thinking about how to really think about it from a climate perspective, how do we align our portfolios? In fact, you can take the slide down now. The real question for us was, how do we align with the Paris Climate Agreement? And to be able to think through our emissions that come from our portfolio, and want to be able to target those and manage those in line with the Paris Climate Agreement, and now in line with sort of, net zero and a 1.5 degree target. How do we do that? And you can't really have that level of transparency about the impact of your portfolio or start to do that targeting work unless you do the first sort of basic act of measuring it. And so that's why we sort of started searching for what that methodology would be. We met the Dutch banks that had been doing this for a few years. And as Nicole noted in the timeline, and then decided, okay, we need to kind of take a similar approach here in North America, a collaborative approach to develop the methodology for application in the North American market, really working very closely with what had been developed in the Netherlands. And we launched with about $50 or so billion of assets, sitting around the table for a year, figuring out how to do this across the asset classes that were relevant for North America. And we launched it at the same time that we launched the kind of new global structure for coming up with a global standard. And the response has been terrific. As Nicole mentioned, now we have $28 trillion of assets globally committed to this. It really is the standard that's sort of been pointed out by the SEC, acting chair of the SEC, Alison Herman Lee, in terms of being a core consideration in mandatory climate disclosures that are under consideration there. It's being developed into the new guidance for TCFD and sort of as a key climate risk metric. And obviously it's the centerpiece of a lot of the targeting work that's happening within the UN process, and also within a whole set of other banks that are committed to net zero or to science-based targets that are outside of the UN Environment Program for financial institutions. So we are later this month, we'll announce our first, we'll publish our first set of emissions for calendar year 19 and 20. It took us a little while. It does take some systems work to be able to kind of pull this together, but we're ready to launch that. And even before that's published, we've started the work around setting targets for our kind of core asset classes, and we're excited to get that done, and knock on wood, we'll be able to do that and deliver that to stakeholders by the COP in Glasgow this November. So I'll stop there. As Nicole knows, I could talk about carbon accounting and Pcaf all day long, 24 hours a day, but I'm excited to hear others talk about the other components of this and to start answering questions.
Yeah, thanks, Ivan. I think I'll take us back into speaker view, or Nicole, you could stop sharing. There we go, great. Yes, and I do see a couple of questions for you both around Pcaf work, but we'll have time after Carrie and Gabe's remarks for questions. So Carrie, wanting to turn it over to you for a couple of minutes, maybe to zoom out even further. Beyond just measuring financed emissions and working to reduce them, we're seeing a lot of major banks make net zero commitments. So perhaps you can walk us through what those commitments look like, and what the level of ambition we should be expecting or looking for among the big banks. What's the component of a net zero commitment when a bank is making it, and how could we continue to move the needle for more and more ambitious climate action from banks?
Yeah. Thanks, Emma. Great to be with you all. Yeah, I wanted to maybe throw some additional comments into the mix that are hopefully additive. So, obviously you can look at net zero commitments from a country like China. Check out BCG's report on how China can meet its 2060 carbon neutrality goals. That's a good document. That would include the finance sector, obviously. In that country, you could look at a company like Microsoft, one of the companies trying to, really move the needle on taking back carbon, companies like Stripe, et cetera. It's a different story for a bank. And I'm mindful of, maybe we need even more data in addition to the great work that Pcaf is doing. For example, you could Google banking on climate chaos, and you could quickly find an approximation of the fossil fuel loans that have been made over the last 5 years since the Paris Agreement by the largest 60 banks in the world. That's extremely transparent. You could argue that the numbers are wrong, but they're just sitting there. And so, the same way we have like a pay ratio that's possible for companies to disclose, like what's the difference between the most highly paid executive and the most lowest paid employee. And you can, by the way, look at that from a diversity and inclusion lens as well. Why don't we have like a brown-green loan book ratio? I mean, the data is just sitting there. There's only been $1 trillion all time in green bonds. It wouldn't take much work to create that sort of ratio on banks to see where they really are today. One would suspect that, when we talk about stranded assets and the $110 trillion of existing fixed income, according to JP Morgan, I think that's about right, versus the 1 trillion all time in green bonds, that, we're kind of out of balance. So to even talk about net zero, we have to sort of recognize where we are. Having said that, there's a big difference between new loans and existing loans, right? Once you loan the money out, it's kind of gone. So the only question is, will you get paid back? And so, for me, most of the focus should be on the future lending and what is its mix, and that's where we can really make progress. So I'd like to see all the efforts on that. Really, I mean, it's great if you're an investor in a bank, like let's say you own the stock of a large institution that's doing lending. I'd like to know that loan book ratio, because that might be a liability at some point. Separately, I'd want to know what are the future plans for lending. And a great example would be one of the Dutch banks, I think, that Ivan mentioned. ASN Bank's done some great work on what does it mean to be climate positive. Their 2018 report has a lot of details on that. The methodologies at their website. I think Pcaf's doing great work. So these comments are all intended to be additive. So that was my answer to your first question. I think you had 3 questions for me. Emma, do you want me to answer all 3 of the questions that you had prepared, or do you want to?
Yeah, well, maybe we'll turn it over to Gabe, and then we'll have plenty of time to circle back to the other comments.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. So Gabe, given your sector expertise and your work around oil and gas and transportation, what do you think are the short-term actions that banks should be taking around their exposure to carbon-intensive sectors and their relationships with high-emitting clients?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. And to your question, I'll start by just setting the stage for why Environmental Defense Fund is involved in this space now, and how that relates to our short-term focus. EDF and EDF Plus Business, which is the team that I work on, has for a long time been focused on corporate partnerships. And there was a realization in the past 1.5 to 2 years that rather than working one-on-one with companies solely to drive change, we could work with financial institutions to set new expectations for either the assets in which they're invested or their clients, in the case of banks, to drive industry-wide change. And if you can get a financial institution to set a new standard on, say, methane in oil and gas, flaring in oil and gas, or electrification in the case of transportation, then you can cause multiple companies to change their behavior in the immediate term rather than working one-on-one with, Chevron over many years. And to your question directly, Emma, it's good, of course, that we're seeing more and more banks make net zero by 2050 commitments, but that has to just be the first step, and it's by no means the end goal. We can't start slashing emissions in the few years before 2050. It needs to happen now if we want to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement, and we need 50% emissions reduction by 2030. So that requires banks indicating to their clients and working with their clients in creating a real decarbonization plan and pathway to meet those interim benchmarks. Net zero by 2050 is the end goal, but unless you have those milestones along the way, you can't verifiably reach that end goal. And like you mentioned, we at EDF are working closely on oil and gas and transportation. And I'll just flag a few areas for the audience to pay attention to, and then would be happy to take questions and discuss further with the rest of the panel. But on oil and gas, we really see flaring, routine flaring, as one of the most actionable opportunities for near-term decarbonization. And I can post in the chat a link to a report we did recently with Gaffney Klein on flaring practices in the Permian Basin. And the point I want to emphasize here is that eliminating routine flaring for an oil and gas company is extremely achievable. We already see companies in the Permian like Pioneer and Chevron with flaring intensity rates of less than 1%. And if you look at the Permian as a whole, the average flaring intensity is about 3.7%. So it's well below that average, and it's on a path to zero routine flaring, which we think is necessary to reach by 2025. And that's an area where banks can have impact. Not only are you advising your client to reach net zero by 2050, but you're also setting that interim benchmark that you need to phase out routine flaring by 2025. And that just becomes another way to hold your client accountable for their decarbonization plan. And we would want those expectations to come with consequences. So if you don't reach zero routine flaring by 2025, well, maybe you're going to see a change in cost of capital from your bank, and it's going to be harder to get the same financing that you were accustomed to. That's what we think is necessary to ultimately reach net zero by 2050, but it requires baking in near-term actionable sector-specific benchmarks and requirements. On the transportation side of things, I'll direct the audience to some research we did recently on what we're calling zero emissions delivery zone financing, or Z zone financing. And the idea here is that a lot of major brands, IKEA, Etsy, eBay, they don't own their fleets, they don't own their trucks, but they still rely heavily on diesel trucking. But they can still make influence and impact in this area by talking to their carriers and sending a demand signal to carriers saying, we guarantee that if you switch over to electric trucks in the most immediate term, we will help, we will be guaranteed customers for that. So we're drawing on a power purchasing agreement type model from the renewables industry, and we're applying it to transportation and saying, look, if you're IKEA and you provide that guarantee to the carriers that you're contracting, it allows them to then go to a bank, and the bank has more certainty now that loan is going to be repaid because you have demand guaranteed on the back end. But again, that requires banks to be proactive. It can't just come from the IKEAs and the carriers. They're ultimately going to need financing to achieve those transition plans. And the banks can take the initiative. If you are lending to an IKEA, and let's say an IKEA, another major shipper, hasn't yet initiated that conversation with one of their carriers, maybe you, the bank, can start to raise that conversation and say, what are you doing about your scope 3 emissions from transportation? What are you doing about air pollution that comes from your transportation, which is a real ESG risk and environmental justice risk? So that's the way we're thinking about it at EDF. There are other organizations that have more expertise than we do on the long-term financing structures that need to take place to achieve this. What we bring to the table is our sector specific focus. And again, that emphasis on actionability. So I'll stop there and want to leave as much time as we can for questions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gabe. And it'll be really interesting to see what kind of sector specific penalties and incentives start to get worked into financing high emitting sectors. So a few participant questions have come in that I'd like to voice. One came in during your remarks, Nicole, really thinking about the emissions footprint of financial institutions. Is there some kind of percentage or ratio of a financial institution's scope 3 emissions versus their scope 1 and 2 that can help to illustrate that?
So typically for financial institutions, scope 3 will be the vast majority, say over 95% of their emissions compared to scopes 1 and 2.
Yeah, so really immense difference there.
Yeah.
And for the institutions that have started to successfully measure a good amount of their portfolios, is that proving valid, or is that more of an estimate based on what we know?
So is that percentage actually reflected in the disclosures that we've seen so far?
Yeah.
I believe generally for most institutions, it is scope 3 is responsible for the majority of the total footprint. If you'd like to see examples of disclosures from Pcaf members, you can visit our website, carbonaccountingfinancials.com, to see what's there. And I believe in general, at least if not for all of our members that have disclosed that, you would see that breakdown.
Great, thank you. Yeah, but absolutely a significant contribution to our climate crisis. Another question that came through, Cary, maybe I'll have you answer this one. This is about if these net zero commitments include elements of drawdown, sequestration, offsets.
Yeah, I think if everyone just offsets their emissions, we still have climate disaster. So Mark Carney got a lot of pushback for suggesting that was what net zero should be. I think increasingly everyone is realizing that if we are going to go do negative carbon things, that they actually need to be drawing down carbon. So, and it will be hard because, while a lot of people are working on sequestration and other nature-based solutions, the scalability from a financial perspective is a challenge. So, I don't think it's a question of can we do it, it's a question of when can we do it at scale. And the clock's kind of ticking. So that's the dilemma we face, I guess is the right way to put it.
Great, thank you for that. Another question, maybe Ivan, this would be a good one for you. How to understand the overlap or not between a Pcaf disclosure and TCFD, or how a TCFD disclosure could complement the Pcaf, and perhaps why BlackRock is focused on advocating for TCFD participation over Pcaf measurement.
So TCFD was started principally to address risk in the corporate sector, inclusive of the financial sector, but broadly. And so the audience for that is investors, right? So it's saying to an investor, okay, when you invest in a company, is there a risk that you're not seeing because of climate change? And so the kind of guidance and the structure of TCFD was to say, hey, okay, investor beware, but we're going to be transparent about the risks that are present because of climate change. Pcaf is a data point, or your exposure to emissions, or the emissions that are attributable to you, is one data point that you could use to assess climate risk for a financial institution. But it is certainly not the only thing that you would want to use. So Pcaf kind of contributes to that, but other disclosures will need to be made. Other actions will need to be taken by companies. Some of it's related to governance, some of it's operational and physical risk, transition risk. There's a lot of things that kind of play into this. Pcaf also plays a role sort of beyond that risk frame into impact, which is sort of where I started the conversation, thinking, okay, but it also then helps you to sort of kind of understand and manage or mitigate your kind of the impact that you have, which is a kind of a discrete objective for many institutions. BlackRock they're in a different position when they're talking about their portfolio companies, right? But they're, versus their own assets. But what they're saying to their portfolio companies is, we want you to do TCFD, but they're also now saying that they want them to see that how they're going to align with the net zero world. And they've kind of committed themselves to report the kind of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. So these, number 15 financed emissions, they've committed to reporting that for all of the assets that they have under management. So I don't think they've kind of been very clear about TCFD, but they're now, with this last letter and the work that they're doing, are very clear now about the kind of alignment piece and financed emissions piece that they're going to do with portfolio companies.
Yeah, thanks for that. I wanted to pose, another question has just come in. A question for Ivan and Nicole. How are you approaching your just transition in your financing activities? And I think that possibly all of the panelists can probably comment on this one, but how is a just climate transition being incorporated into this finance emissions reduction work?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you want me to jump in on that one, Nicole? Because Nicole's not financing things; she's just measuring. But and it's not an explicit thing within Pcaf, because we're just measuring carbon emissions. We're not, measuring other factors of lending. There is an assumption that from a social equity perspective and a justice perspective, that there's obviously disproportionate impact from climate change on communities of color, low-income communities, and so there, the kind of this shift would hopefully have a disproportionate benefit. But moreover, these emissions have a direct relationship to the real economy, right? And sort of where you're spending your money. So I would argue that nothing is as disastrous to fence line communities and to racial equity is like the fossil fuel industry and what they're kind of the havoc that they're wreaking. I just saw, I can't believe this is not news here, but like the oil refinery that blew up in Indonesia, it just was enormous. And you think about the impact of that. But for us, we do think about it as sort of like the kind of, maybe going back to that first slide that I showed, the positive impact that we have I think the number is 23% of our portfolio is going into climate solutions. The huge portion of that is solar. And we are very focused on solar that has a sort of equity component to it. So we do a lot of solar that is community solar, that is about directing the assets back to kind of local communities to kind of own that, rather than sort of just financing power generation off in some field somewhere. We do a lot of financing of solar on affordable housing in such a way that it's not just making money for a developer, but it's actually lowering utility bills for low-income energy off-takers. And so, that's a huge portion of the work that we do, is we're sort of trying to see, okay, not just what's the climate impact, but what's the triple bottom line impact of the portfolio that we have.
Yeah, if I could just very, very quickly add, at the Sustainable Finance Institute, we're doing the IRIS Plus work for the Gen on clean energy, and it very much includes the just transition. There are basically as many as nine different goals that need to be considered when you're making an energy investment. The just transition considerations, local community considerations are very much part of that, and that's work that will take a few months to complete. And you can think about China. There's like 1 million coal workers in China, or some number like that. And so every part of the world is going to have to think about its transition.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. A follow-on question about community solar and affordable housing. Has the New York Green Bank been supportive of that work or involved in that in any way?
They're doing a lot of that work. New York Green Bank is a little bit market rate finance, so they're a little bit set up more to compete with lenders like us. Honestly, we work with the Connecticut Green Bank a lot, and their offshoot Inclusive Prosperity Capital. We not only work with the DC Green Bank, but we actually are the bank for the DC Green Bank. So we provide the kind of operations and banking support for them. And we work with them on transactions as well. We also work with, it's not a closed deal, so I can't name the names, but we have a facility in a very coal-rich state for a solar developer where we've gone to private guarantors to kind of help make that work and provide finance for a solar company that is fully uses IBEW workers, right? So I think there's as we make this transition and we try to do it in the kind of some of the hardest places, there's a need for this kind of concessionary capital or sort of publicly supported capital to be able to kind of leverage larger private sector investments.
Great, very exciting work. Yeah, thank you for that. Cary, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about China's net zero commitment and plan. So I know that from what I understand, a part of that is a way to offer incentives and subsidies for green financing activities. So I'm curious if you have examples, or you can really explain what those look like and what that's going to mean.
Sure, thanks, Emma. Yeah, we've had so far pretty much a Western conversation. Asia's half the world's economy. And so actually China's become a leader in green finance policy, which is exciting. Dr. Ma Jun in particular, who is the lead in the US-China climate negotiations that are going on, that Janet Yellen is on one side of, and with Secretary Cary. So examples of what they're doing. Thinking about requiring minimum green finance percentages of their banks, penalties for those who don't do that, incentives for those that do, better coupon rates for green finance, all sorts of obviously EV incentives, and you just look at the stock price of NEO over the last year for an example of how that can be beneficial to investors. Pollution pricing mechanisms. We have a chapter in our book, Modern China, that you mentioned, about how China's become a leader in green finance policy. It'll be very interesting to see what the country does, even over the next few weeks, because obviously April 22nd is the Earth Day Climate Leaders Summit, and China's announced 5-year plan is not ambitious enough. And they're going to have to do a lot more between 2025 and 2030 to meet their carbon peaking goal. And they tend to meet their goals. So, we'll see when they start their rapid acceleration in this direction. It hasn't really been happening enough, to be fair. But the most creative person in the world on green finance policy, probably by far, is Dr. Ma Jun. There's like no one even close to second.
Great. Well, I hope more people look into his work. Gabe, maybe you can speak about a policy and regulation here at home that we should look to, and what kinds of policies are EDF tracking and supporting that relate to sustainability in the financial sector.
Yeah, thanks for that. And we've spoken a lot in this conversation about disclosure. There was a question about TCFD and how that relates to Pcaf. We're focused heavily right now at EDF on this request for public comment from the Securities and Exchange Commission on mandatory climate risk disclosure. And our goal at EDF is to push towards a final rule on mandatory climate risk disclosure in the next 2 years. And the rationale really being that we can't track our progress towards emissions reduction by 2030 or net zero by 2050 unless we have accurate, decision useful, comparable information on climate from companies all across the economy. And sure, there are some companies that are voluntarily releasing climate-related financial disclosures already, but overwhelmingly, we're seeing gaps in reporting, and in TCFD's 2020 status update, they even highlighted the fact that less than 10% of companies are including climate risk disclosure in their annual reports. So it's a big gap, and we're really going all out to push for this change in the SEC, and also recognizing that it's beneficial for companies, it's beneficial for investors, for banks on a variety of fronts. And we're hoping that banks will weigh in positively on the need for improved rulemaking, because it helps them assess risks of clients, and it ultimately allows financial markets to operate more efficiently when you can understand that certain assets are more risky than others. And right now that data just is not as transparent as we would like. And so to the audience, I would actually encourage anybody who is interested to weigh in and submit a comment now that we have this unique 90-day window from the SEC to field stakeholder input. And that deadline is June 13th. I can drop my email in the chat too for anybody who would like more information. So that's one bucket is the SEC that we're focused on at EDF, but I'll also just flag the importance of policy engagement on more sector-specific issues from financial institutions. Traditionally, banks, asset managers have been reluctant to weigh in on climate regulation. One, they feel like it's not their area of expertise. Two, they're worried about angering clients, and there just hasn't been that proactive engagement. But we're really encouraging our financial partners to use the leverage they have as major companies, linchpins of the global economy, to talk to policymakers, talk to elected officials about the need for improved climate regulation in specific sectors. And we have another, just as we have a unique opportunity with the SEC, we have a unique opportunity with the Biden administration writ large to enact more ambitious climate policies. So to get a bit more specific, we're focused on updated methane regulations from the EPA. And we're also hoping that with Biden's infrastructure proposal, that we'll see new incentives for vehicle electrification, and specifically truck electrification, which has gone a bit under discussed in conversations thus far. And we don't think that advocacy needs to be confined just to the companies in those sectors. We think that financial institutions, given their exposure to these companies, can also and should also be discussing these issues and opportunities with regulators.
Great, thank you. And I hope that a lot of comments come through for that ruling. Another question was around the ratio of brown to green lending, and if there is a framework for defining such activities, or would it be up to individual banks?
Maybe I should go in for Nicole. She hasn't been involved enough. She asked me.
Yeah. Nicole, are you aware of anything that would measure those types of financing activities?
Not that I'm aware of, so maybe I'll kick it back to Cary or Ivan, who provide resources on this topic.
I actually just put something in the chat that was a report from a little over a year ago from WRI that took the sustainable finance commitments from banks and sort of matched them up against last year's version of the Banking on Climate Crisis report, which is an amazing report that Carrie mentioned earlier. It just came out a little while ago, the latest numbers. It's incredible. But what they found in this report was that only about half the banks have a real sustainable finance commitment. And for most of those, it trails their dirty financing. I like to say dirty rather than brown for equity reasons. But and that there was no real definition or transparency, and they kind of measured on this question, sort of how transparent were they about how they were doing it, forget even whether they're consistent. So one of the senior people at WRI is now, Leo Martinez is now working with Senator Cary, on his work. And I sort of assume that one of the things they're trying to do is create a little order out of the chaos of these sustainable finance commitments, so that we're all counting the same things and that we're counting them over the same timeframes, and that we can really understand what these commitments mean from the perspective of how it's going to change the kind of real economy.
If I could just add maybe a question for Gabe or fellow panelists. Speaking of Secretary Cary, apparently he has mentioned this morning, or it's in the news, that to expect an executive order on climate disclosure. Gabe, is that something you've heard of, or anyone? I'm just curious, hot off the press.
Yeah, I have heard talk of that. I imagine, Ivan, you can also probably speak to it. But from what I've heard, that's to be expected. I believe April 22nd is what I've heard.
Wow, that's great. Before we kind of wrap up into closing remarks, there is another question for Nicole around what it takes for a bank to join Pcaf, what that really looks like, and what kind of support is available to banks who join Pcaf in terms of how to grapple with such a daunting task of beginning to measure all these financed emissions.
Yeah, so when financial institutions commit to Pcaf, they're saying that they will disclose at least part of their financed emissions portfolio within 3 years of signing the commitment letter. There are no specific requirements in terms of which asset class or what percentage of your portfolio. We know it's quite a bit of work. Ideally, it would be your entire footprint, but any disclosure is better than none. And the general idea is that you would expand the scope over time. The other two commitments are to be publicly recognized on our website, carbonaccountingfinancials.com. And because we're seeking to create a critical mass of financial institutions, implementing the methodology to help us get to our goal of at least 250 members by the end of 2022. And in terms of support, the Secretariat can help members identify appropriate emission factors, use the emission factor database that we've put together, and answer questions on the methodology. So there is support for members if they would like to join. And we know it's a new exercise for a lot of them, so we're here to help them through the journey.
That's great. Yeah, and judging by the speed in financial institutions joining up on Pcaf, I bet that goal will be achieved, and especially given emerging regulation where these kinds of disclosures will be required, there'll certainly be a flood. So I'm sure you'll be very busy and continue to be very busy. There is maybe a clarifying question digging into it says the Federal Reserve has started participating in some international financial climate red group or framework. Would you clarify that, or might the Fed comment on the SEC's effort? Any of our panelists aware of that international participation?
Is it NGFS? Is that the acronym that sort of global central bankers that we have joined? In fact, I think we were joining it even before the last election. So yeah, April 22nd will be a really interesting day when we have leaders getting together to do San Gimignano, if anyone knows what that means. Google San Gimignano and you'll see what I mean.
Sounds like a lovely village in Italy.
Yeah, it's families in medieval age tried to build houses bigger than the next family, and so it's all out of scale. Anyway, hopefully there'll be a race for him to be ambitious. That's my hope. Anyway.
Great. Yes, I hope so as well. Well, it is 1 o'clock. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and the Impact Capital Forum for hosting, and to all of our panelists for a really informative, great conversation. And I hope that everyone participating found this informative and actionable, and that you'll be able to take these insights further into your work in the industry and consider a strategy or advocating for a strategy of reduced financed emissions. So stay safe and well wherever you are. And with that, I will hand it over to Mike in case there are any last concluding comments.
Yeah, I want to thank Emma, you and all the panelists for putting together a very intelligent conversation around carbon emissions, which we don't often get to witness. And I want to thank everybody that was able to join us and for all the great questions you've asked. Again, I'd like to ask anybody and everybody who's here who isn't already a member to consider membership, as it allows us to continue to put on great events as you've just witnessed. And with that, I will give you guys back your afternoon. Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care.